The morning light filtered through the crystalline spires of the astral palace, casting rainbow patterns across Princess Hejin's chambers. She stood at her favorite spot by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the three moons of her world fade into the dawn sky. Her iridescent skin shimmered as she moved, a mark of her pure astral bloodline that had been carefully cultivated over thousands of years. "Your Highness," a soft voice called from behind her, "Prince Minho has arrived for your meeting." Hejin didn't turn around. Instead, she continued gazing at the sprawling capital city below, where golden towers reached toward the stars like fingers trying to grasp the heavens themselves. "Send him away, Jia-yun." Like all the others, her attendant shifted uncomfortably, the subtle rustle of her ceremonial robes betraying her anxiety. "This will be the 123rd suitor you've rejected without even granting an audience, Your Highness. The High Council is concerned." "Let them be concerned." Hejin finally turned, her violet eyes catching the light in a way that made them appear to glow from within. "Have you seen his genetic profile, Jia-yun? Perfect matches in all the approved categories. Enhanced intelligence, optimal physical structure, predicted lifespan of 300 years. She picked up a delicate crystal flower from her desk, a rare specimen that had been engineered to never wilt. Just like all the others. Perfect, pristine, and utterly lifeless. Jia-yun's face showed a flash of understanding before she carefully schooled her features back into their proper, servile expression. She had served the princess long enough to recognize the weight of melancholy in her voice. "The council believes Prince Minho would be an ideal match," Jia-yun said carefully. "His bloodline would complement yours, producing offspring with unprecedented genetic stability." Hejin placed the crystal flower back on her desk with deliberate care. "Did you know, Jia-yun, that in the ancient days, before we became so focused on genetic perfection, our people used to write poetry, create art, dance for the pure joy of movement?" She walked to a hidden panel in her wall and pressed her palm against it. The panel slid aside, revealing a small collection of forbidden treasures. Paintings, books, and artifacts from across the galaxy. "These are from a time when our people still knew how to feel, to create, to live." Hejin picked up a worn book, its pages made of actual paper, a rarity in their digital age. "Now we engineer our children before they're born, program their minds with approved knowledge, and call it progress." Jia-yun glanced nervously at the door. The princess's collection of primitive artifacts was a closely guarded secret. If the council discovered it, even Hejin's royal status might not protect her from censure. A soft chime echoed through the chamber. Another message from the council, no doubt. Hejin waved her hand, and a holographic display materialized in the air. The face of Council Elder Sungho appeared, his features arranged in an expression of diplomatic concern. "Princess Hejin," he began, his voice carrying the weight of artificial gravitas, "your continued rejection of suitable matches threatens the stability of our society. The genetic profile of the astral ruling line must be maintained. Prince Minho represents the pinnacle of our breeding programs." Hejin met his gaze steadily. "And what of his soul, Elder? Can your programs measure that?" The Elder's face flickered with barely concealed irritation. "Such primitive concepts have no place in modern astrology society. We have evolved beyond the need for these emotional indulgences. Have we evolved, Elder? Or have we simply forgotten what it means to be alive?" Hejin's voice carried a sharp edge that made Jia-yun wince. The Elder's hologram stiffened. "You have until the next lunar alignment to select a suitable mate, Princess. If you fail to do so, the Council will be forced to take extraordinary measures." The hologram vanished, leaving the chamber in sudden silence. Jia-yun watched as Hejin walked back to the window, her bearing regal despite the weight of the threat that had just been delivered. "Do you know what I dream of, Jia-yun?" Hejin asked softly, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon, where the first of their 3 moons was setting. "I dream of someone who can surprise me, someone who sees the universe not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be embraced. Someone who understands that perfection isn't found in flawless genes, but in the beautiful chaos of a heart that knows how to love. Jai-yun moved closer to her princess, dropping the formal distance usually maintained between royalty and servants. Such desires are dangerous, Your Highness. The Council. The Council can chart the movement of stars and reshape the very code of life. The Jinn interrupted, but they cannot program the spark that makes life worth living. She pressed her hand against the cool crystal of the window. Somewhere out there, beyond our perfect society, beyond our carefully controlled evolution, there must be something more, someone more. As if in response to her words, an alert flashed across the window's surface, an incoming transmission from the Galactic Council, news that would soon shake the foundations of Astrali society and bring that something more He-Jin yearned for closer than she could imagine. But for now she stood in her tower, a princess trapped in a cage of perfection, watching the stars and dreaming of imperfection's sweet freedom. The next lunar alignment was approaching, and with it, a choice that would either bow to tradition or break it entirely. The weight of that choice hung in the air like the crystal flower on her desk, beautiful, precious, and ultimately artificial. Little did He-Jin know that across the galaxy, a species the Astrali considered barely civilized was preparing their first diplomatic mission to the stars. Among them, a man who would challenge everything her society believed about perfection and everything she believed about herself. The news of Earth joining the Galactic Council spread through the astral palace like ripples in a still pond. Princess He-Jin watched from her private observation deck as the human diplomatic vessel breached the atmosphere, its design noticeably different from the sleek Astrali ships that usually graced their skies. The ship was sturdy, functional, and to Astrali eyes, hopelessly primitive. "They call it the Star Voyager," Jai-yun informed her, reading from a holographic display. "Their first deep space diplomatic vessel. The Council reports indicate their technology is at least 3 centuries behind ours." He-Jin leaned forward, intrigued by the ship's ungraceful but determined descent. "And yet they made it here, didn't they? Against all expectations." The landing ceremony was scheduled for midday, when all 3 moons would be visible in the sky, a rare alignment considered auspicious in Astrali culture. The Great Hall had been prepared according to ancient protocols, its crystal walls programmed to emit subtle harmonics that would inspire awe in less advanced species. As He-Jin took her place on the ceremonial platform, she noticed the barely concealed disdain on the faces of the council members. To them, accepting humans into the Galactic Council was a political necessity, nothing more. Earth's vast resources made them valuable, even if their species was considered unrefined. The massive doors of the Great Hall swung open, and the human delegation entered. He-Jin's attention immediately fixed on the man leading the military contingent. Captain Tae-ho Kim moved with a confidence that seemed to ignore the overwhelming grandeur around him. Unlike the perfectly engineered posture of Astrali nobles, his bearing spoke of earned authority rather than programmed perfection. What caught her eye most was a small scar near his right eyebrow, a physical imperfection that would have been unthinkable among her people. In Astrali society, such marks were corrected before birth or immediately healed if acquired later. Yet he wore it without shame, as naturally as she wore her royal circlet. The formal introductions began, each human delegate stepping forward to be scanned and registered in the Astrali database. When Captain Kim's turn came, the scanning process took longer than usual. Anomaly detected. The automated system announced. Multiple genetic variances present. Recommendation. Immediate medical intervention. A murmur of discomfort rippled through the Astrali court, but Captain Kim merely smiled. "With respect," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "these variances are part of who I am. They tell the story of my ancestors, their struggles, and their triumphs." He-Jin found herself leaning forward slightly, breaking royal protocol. This was not the diplomatic response expected from a supposedly inferior species, The council members exchanged troubled glances. The ceremony continued, but He-Jin's attention remained fixed on the human captain. She noticed how he studied their technology, not with envy but with genuine curiosity. During the traditional feast that followed, while other delegates merely pretended to enjoy the engineered perfection of Astrali cuisine, Tai-Ho actually seemed to savor each bite. "Your food tells a story," he said when protocol finally allowed him to approach her table. "But I wonder if you've ever tasted something grown in natural soil, under an unfiltered sun." Before He-Jin could respond, Council Elder Sung-Ho smoothly intercepted the conversation. "Captain Kim, surely you understand that natural cultivation methods are highly inefficient and potentially dangerous." "Dangerous?" Tai-Ho's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Perhaps, but isn't that what makes life interesting?" He-Jin caught herself smiling and quickly composed her features, but not before Jae-yun noticed, shooting her a worried glance. Later that evening, as the diplomatic reception wound down, He-Jin observed Captain Kim from her private balcony. He stood in the palace gardens, examining a row of perfectly engineered flowers with an expression that seemed almost sad. "Your Highness," Jae-yun whispered urgently, "you've been watching the human for 23 minutes. The council's monitoring systems will have noticed." "Let them notice," He-Jin replied, though she did step back from the balcony's edge. "Don't you find it strange, Jae-yun? They call humans primitive, yet look at him. He moves through our world carrying his imperfections like medals of honor." "The council would say that's precisely what makes them dangerous," Jae-yun cautioned. "They're unpredictable. Their genetics are chaotic. They age, they scar, they live." He-Jin finished softly. "Really live, not just exist in perfectly programmed patterns." A subtle alert chimed through the room. Another message from the council reminding her of the approaching deadline to choose a mate. He-Jin dismissed it with a wave of her hand, her eyes still drawn to the garden where Captain Kim had now been joined by other human delegates. They were laughing about something, the sound carrying up to her balcony. Real laughter, not the carefully modulated expressions of amusement preferred in Astrali society. He-Jin couldn't remember the last time she'd heard genuine laughter in the palace. "Jae-yun," she said suddenly, "what do you know about Earth's military training?" Her attendant blinked at the unexpected question. "Their methods are considered primitive, Your Highness. They still engage in physical combat training, expose themselves to actual danger during simulations, and—" "No," He-Jin interrupted. "Not what our databases say. What have you observed today?" Jae-yun was quiet for a moment, considering. "They work together differently than our forces. There's a connection that seems to go beyond tactical programming. And Captain Kim, the others look to him even when protocol doesn't require it." "Yes," He-Jin murmured. "They trust him. Not because his genetics command authority, but because he's earned it." Below in the garden, Tai-Ho had produced something from his pocket. A small white flower. He-Jin leaned forward again, protocol forgotten as she watched him plant it in a corner of the garden, away from the engineered specimens. "Your Highness," Jae-yun said softly, "the council will never accept." "The council doesn't need to accept anything." He-Jin cut her off. "I merely find our visitors anthropologically interesting." But as she watched Tai-Ho pat the soil around his planted flower, a real flower, born of Earth's chaotic nature, He-Jin felt something she'd never experienced before, a strange flutter in her chest, a feeling that all the genetic engineering in the universe couldn't have programmed. The 3 moons hung in the sky, their light casting multiple shadows in the garden below. In their eternal dance, they had seen countless perfectly arranged diplomatic functions in the palace. But tonight, they witnessed something new. A princess of the most advanced civilization in the galaxy, watching a primitive human with more interest than she'd ever shown her 123 genetically perfect suitors. And in a hidden corner of the royal gardens, a small earth flower took root in Astrali soil, its very existence a quiet rebellion against engineered perfection. The Stellar Confluence celebration was meant to showcase Astrali's superiority to their new human guests. Instead, it became the day that shook the foundations of everything the Astrali believed about perfection. The great crystal dome of the celebration hall sparkled under the light of 3 moons, its engineered acoustics carrying the sounds of 1,000 conversations in perfect harmony. Princess Hejin stood at her designated position, watching Captain Taiho from the corner of her eye. He seemed fascinated by the floating anti-gravity platforms that carried servants and their perfectly crafted refreshments through the air. Unlike the other human delegates who tried to hide their amazement, he made no attempt to mask his genuine wonder. The anti-gravity grid is our most advanced achievement, Council Elder Sungho was explaining to the Earth delegation. Each platform is controlled by our central AI, making accidents mathematically impossible. As if the universe itself wanted to prove him wrong, a subtle vibration ran through the floor. At first, it was barely noticeable, just enough to make the floating platforms wobble slightly. Then came a sound that no Astrali had heard in generations, the sharp crack of crystal under stress. Jai-yun appeared at Hei-jin's side, her composed features betraying a hint of panic. "Your Highness, the primary gravity generators are showing unexpected fluctuations." Before Hei-jin could respond, the vibrations intensified. The floating platforms began to drift erratically, their perfect patterns dissolving into chaos. High above, the crystal dome groaned under the shifting gravitational forces. "Impossible," Elder Sungho declared, his face pale. "The system is perfect. This cannot happen." But it was happening. The Astrali engineers rushed to their control panels, their movements becoming increasingly frantic as their programmed responses failed to address the escalating crisis. The central AI, faced with a scenario it had never been programmed to handle, began shutting down system after system in an attempt to maintain stability. That's when Captain Taiho broke from the Earth delegation and ran straight for the main control terminal. 2 Astrala guards moved to stop him, but Hei-jin's voice cut through the growing chaos. "Let him pass." The guards hesitated, caught between their programming to protect the technology and their obligation to obey the princess. In that moment of hesitation, Taiho reached the terminal. "Your system's trying to be too perfect," he called out, his fingers flying over the control interface. "Sometimes you need to let things be a little wrong to make them right." The Astrali engineers watched in horror as he bypassed their carefully designed safety protocols, rerouting power in ways their training told them were dangerous and inefficient. But Hei-jin saw something else. She saw adaptation, creativity, and the kind of quick thinking that no amount of programming could replicate. "The backup systems are failing," Jai-yun reported, her usual calm cracking. "The dome's structural integrity is at 60% and falling." Above them, the crystal dome continued to groan. Guests began to panic, their perfectly modulated voices giving way to genuine fear. Hei-jin watched as Taiho worked, his movements sure despite the increasing gravity fluctuations that threatened to throw him off his feet. "There," he shouted, executing a final command sequence. "It's not elegant, but it should hold." For a moment, nothing seemed to change. Then, gradually, the vibrations began to subside. The floating platforms stabilized, though at odd angles that would have offended Astrali aesthetic sensibilities under normal circumstances. The dome's groaning quieted to a soft whisper before falling silent. "What did you do?" Elder Sungho demanded, his face flushed with a mix of relief and outrage. "I made it imperfect," Taiho explained, wiping sweat from his forehead. Another display that made the Astrali uncomfortable. "Your system was trying to maintain perfect balance in all subsystems simultaneously. Sometimes you need to let some systems run at 80% so others can give you 120. Hei-jin moved closer, fascinated by the way he'd handled the crisis. "You've dealt with similar situations before." "On Earth, we learn to expect the unexpected," he replied, his eyes meeting hers directly. A breach of protocol that sent whispers through the watching crowd. "Perfect systems are perfect until they're not." It's the imperfect ones that teach you how to handle surprises. The next hours were a blur of activity. Astrally engineers analyzed Taiho's modifications, simultaneously impressed and horrified by their elegant inefficiency. The council convened an emergency session to discuss the security implications of allowing a human to access their technology. And through it all, He-Jin found herself watching Taiho as he calmly explained his actions to increasingly agitated officials. Later that night, she stood in her private garden, looking up at the repaired dome. Jia-yun approached quietly, carrying a datapad. "The preliminary analysis is complete, Your Highness. Captain Kim's solution wasn't just unconventional. It revealed fundamental flaws in our approach to system design. The council is disturbed." "Of course they are," He-Jin said softly. He showed them that perfection can be a weakness, that sometimes the flaws we engineer away are exactly what we need to survive. She touched the small earth flower Taiho had planted days ago. It had grown slightly crooked, reaching for light in its own imperfect way. Yet it lived, thrived even, among its engineered cousins. "The council is calling for restrictions on human access to our technology," Jia-yun continued. "They're saying today's events prove that humans are too unpredictable, too dangerous." "No," He-Jin corrected. "Today's events prove that they're exactly what we need. We've engineered ourselves into a corner, Jia-yun. We've become so focused on avoiding failures that we've forgotten how to overcome them." A soft step behind them made them turn. Captain Taiho stood at the garden's entrance, still in his slightly disheveled uniform from the crisis. "Princess," he said, bowing slightly, "I came to apologize for breaking protocol." He-Jin studied him. This human who had dared to make their perfect systems imperfect, who had saved them by ignoring everything they believed about proper procedures. "Protocol," she said finally, "is just another cage we've built for ourselves." She gestured to the flower he had planted. "Like this garden, we engineer our flowers to be perfect, never considering that their imperfections might carry their own kind of strength." For a moment, they stood in silence, the three moons casting multiple shadows that danced and merged in ways no computer would have designed. In that moment, He-Jin felt something shift inside her, a recognition that perhaps perfection wasn't what she had been taught it was. And somewhere in the palace, the council was already drafting new protocols to prevent another such incident, never realizing that their pursuit of perfect safety was exactly what had made them so dangerously vulnerable in the first place. Music filled the grand ballroom of the Astral Palace as the annual Starlight Ball began. But this year was different. Among the perfectly choreographed movements of Astrali nobles, there was an element of chaos. The human delegation, moving to rhythms that defied the carefully calculated harmonies of Astrali culture. Princess He-Jin watched from her elevated platform as Captain Taiho talked with a group of younger Astrali nobles. Despite the council's attempts to limit interaction after the gravity generator incident, the humans had proven surprisingly adept at breaking through social barriers. "He's teaching them something called a waltz," Jia-yun reported, her voice carrying a mix of concern and curiosity. "It's apparently a traditional Earth dance form. The council is most disturbed by its unpredictable nature." Below, Taiho demonstrated the basic steps to his fascinated audience. His movements were smooth but natural, lacking the precise perfection of Astrali dance. Yet there was a grace to it that He-Jin found herself drawn to. "Your Highness," Elder Sung-ho materialized at her side. "Perhaps you should remind our young nobles about proper cultural protocols." He-Jin kept her eyes on the impromptu dance lesson. "And what protocols would those be, Elder? The ones about cultural exchange, or the ones about maintaining our artificial superiority?" Before the elder could respond, Taiho looked up and met He-Jin's gaze. In a move that sent gasps through the ballroom, he walked directly to the base of her platform and bowed. "Princess," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room, "would you honor me with a dance?" The silence deepened. In all of Astrali history, no one had ever dared to ask the royal family to deviate from their ceremonial dances. These were precisely choreographed movements passed down through generations, each step calculated to demonstrate their genetic and cultural superiority. Captain Kim, Elder Sung-ho began, "You cannot possibly expect." "I accept," He-jin said, rising from her seat. The whispers that swept through the room were decidedly unprogrammed. As she descended the platform steps, Jae-yun hurried to her side. "Your Highness, there are no approved protocols for this type of dance." "Exactly," He-jin replied, a small smile playing at her lips. Tae-ho took her hand, another breach of protocol that caused several council members to pale visibly. "The waltz is simple," he explained, positioning himself. "Just follow my lead and feel the music." "Feel the music," He-jin repeated. In Estrali dance, music was a mathematical construct designed to enhance the precision of their movements. "Don't think about it," he said softly. "Just listen and move." They began to dance, and He-jin discovered what it meant to move without perfect calculation. The waltz wasn't about precision. It was about connection, about two people moving together in a way that couldn't be programmed. As they turned across the floor, she noticed something extraordinary. The other dancers had stopped to watch, but their faces showed more than the standard expressions of shock or disapproval. There was curiosity there, and something else, longing. "Your people are watching," Tae-ho commented as he guided her through another turn. "They've never seen anything like this," she replied. We don't dance for joy, only for demonstration." Then they've never really danced at all. The music shifted, and Tae-ho adjusted their movements naturally. He-jin found herself relaxing into the rhythm, letting go of the perfect posture that had been engineered into her genes. "You're a natural," he said, smiling. "I'm making mistakes," she pointed out, feeling the imperfect placement of her feet. "Those aren't mistakes, princess. They're what make it real." Around them, something unexpected was happening. Other couples were attempting to mimic their movements. Younger Estrali, those less set in their ways, were asking the human delegates to teach them. The carefully ordered patterns of the Starlight Ball were dissolving into something organic and alive. Elder Sung-ho appeared at the edge of the dance floor, his face a study in controlled distress. "Your Highness, this is most irregular. The traditional dances are beautiful," He-jin interrupted, not stopping her waltz. "But they're not the only way to move, Elder. Look around you. Look at what happens when we let ourselves be a little less perfect." The ballroom had transformed. Where there had been precise, programmed movements, now there was laughter. Where there had been carefully modulated expressions, now there were genuine smiles. The humans were teaching, the Estreli were learning, and the barriers between them were beginning to blur. "This is dangerous," Jae-yun whispered when He-jin finally took a break. "The council will see it as corruption of our culture." "Our culture," He-jin replied, watching as a young Estrali noble attempted to teach Tae-ho one of their traditional dances in return, "was meant to grow, to evolve. We're the ones who trapped it in crystal." The night continued, and with each passing hour, more Estrali joined in the cultural exchange. Some tried the waltz, others learned earth songs, and a few even dared to laugh openly when they stumbled. Near midnight, as the three moons aligned in the sky above the crystal dome, He-jin found herself back in the garden with Tae-ho. The earth flower he had planted had grown stronger, its slightly crooked stems supporting a bloom that caught the moonlight in ways no engineered flower could match. "Tonight changed something," she said, touching the flower's petals gently. "Your people have been waiting for permission to be imperfect," he replied. "Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to take the first step. Or one dance," she added, looking at him with new understanding. From the ballroom, they could still hear music, but now it was a blend of Estrali harmonies and earth melodies, creating something entirely new. Like the flower in the garden, it wasn't perfect, but it was alive. "The council will try to prevent this from happening again," He-jin said, but there was no worry in her voice. "They can try," Tae-ho agreed, But some things, once learned, can't be unlearned. Your people have tasted freedom tonight. The freedom to move without calculation, to laugh without programming, to be themselves without perfect control. In the distance, the first light of dawn was beginning to appear. The starlight ball was ending, but Hejin knew that something else was just beginning. Her people had taken their first steps away from the cage of perfection, and like a flower growing toward the sun, they would find their own way to bloom. The aftermath of the starlight ball sent ripples through Astrali society that no one could have predicted. Within days, young nobles began gathering in secret to practice earth dances. Recordings of human music circulated through private channels. And in the highest towers of the astral palace, the council gathered to address what they saw as a growing crisis. Princess Hejin sat in her chambers, reviewing reports of these cultural disturbances when the first attack occurred. A transport carrying Earth delegates to a cultural exchange event suddenly lost power and plummeted from the sky. Only the quick thinking of its pilot prevented a tragedy. Another accident, Jia-Yun reported, her voice tight with concern. Third this week, the human embassy's communication systems were compromised yesterday, and their living quarters lost life support for 6 minutes this morning. Hejin looked up from her holographic display. These are not accidents. No, a voice agreed from the doorway. Taiho stood there, looking unusually grave. We've analyzed the patterns. Someone's trying to force us off-world. The princess gestured for him to enter, noting how Jia-Yun automatically moved to block the security cameras, a small act of rebellion that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. Council member Sungmin is leading the opposition, Hejin said, pulling up a series of reports. He claims human influence is destabilizing our society, that we're seeing increased instances of emotional irregularity among our youth. Taiho's mouth quirked in a half-smile. They're calling happiness and curiosity irregularities now. You don't understand, Jia-Yun interrupted, her usual composure cracking. The council has maintained stability for 10,000 years by controlling every aspect of our development. What's happening now? The dancing, the music, the unregulated emotional expressions. It threatens everything they've built. Everything they've caged, Hejin corrected softly. Before anyone could respond, the room's lighting flickered and died. The environmental controls followed, sending the temperature plummeting. Through the window, they could see similar failures spreading across the city like a wave of darkness. The main power grid, Jia-Yun gasped. But that's impossible. The systems are perfect. Perfect systems have perfect vulnerabilities, Taiho said, already moving to the door. Someone who knows exactly how they work can predict exactly how they'll fail. Hejin rose from her seat, decision made. We need to reach the central control hub. Jia-Yun, gather whatever data you can about recent access to the power systems. Captain, I'll need your help. They moved through the darkening palace corridors, passing groups of confused Astrali nobles who seemed lost without their technological guidance systems. Hejin led them through secret passages she discovered as a child, ways that didn't depend on power or computers. Your Highness, a stern voice called out as they neared the control hub. Council member Sungmin stood blocking their path, flanked by security drones. This area is restricted during the emergency. An emergency you created, Hejin replied, her voice carrying the weight of royal authority. How many need to die before you're satisfied? Council member. Sungmin's perfect features showed no reaction. I don't know what you mean, Your Highness. But clearly, these system failures prove that human influence has made our technology unstable. For safety, they must be removed. The only instability, Taiho said quietly, is in those who fear change, so much they'd rather destroy than adapt. The security drones moved forward, their sensors focusing on the human captain. But before they could act, Jia-Yun stepped forward, holding up a data crystal. Access logs, she announced, showing unauthorized entry to critical systems from the council member's private terminal, time-stamped and authenticated. For the first time, Some Min's composure cracked. "You dare to spy on a council member?" "I dare to protect my people," He Jin countered, "even from themselves." What followed was chaos of a kind the Australi hadn't seen in generations. As He Jin and Tae-ho worked to restore power, evidence of the conspiracy spread through the emergency channels. Young Australi, those same ones who had learned to dance and laugh, took to the streets in protest, not with perfect, programmed precision, but with passionate, messy determination. In the control hub, He Jin watched as Tae-ho once again broke all the rules to make things right. His methods were unorthodox, even dangerous by Australi standards, but they worked. "Your society isn't breaking," he told her as they waited for systems to reboot. "It's growing. Growth is always a little chaotic." "Like that flower you planted," she replied, thinking of how it had thrived despite breaking every rule of their engineered gardens. As power returned to the city, the council convened an emergency session. He Jin stood before them, no longer just a princess who had defied tradition by dancing with a human, but a leader who had helped save her people from their own rigid perfection. "We cannot return to what we were," she declared to the assembled council. "Nor should we want to. Look at what our pursuit of perfection almost cost us today." The debate raged for hours, but in the end, even the most conservative council members had to acknowledge that their perfect system had created perfect vulnerabilities. Change wasn't just coming, it was necessary for survival. Later, in her garden, He Jin found Tae-ho examining the earth flower he had planted. It had grown larger, and other plants nearby had begun to show signs of natural variation, as if inspired by its imperfect beauty. "What happens now?" he asked as she joined him. "Now we learn to balance," she replied. "Between order and chaos, between perfection and growth." She touched the flower's petals gently. "We learn to live." Above them, the three moons continued their eternal dance, watching as the most perfectly engineered civilization in the galaxy took its first uncertain steps toward something messier but far more alive. In the streets below, music could be heard. Not the mathematically precise harmonies of old, but something new, something that blended astrally precision with human passion. And in the garden, an earth flower continued to grow, crooked and beautiful, a symbol of the changes that no amount of genetic engineering could have predicted or prevented. The ancient chambers of the trial arena hadn't been used in over a century. Crystalline walls rose high into the artificial atmosphere, their surfaces programmed to record and display every moment of the challenges ahead. Today, these walls would witness something unprecedented, a human attempting the trials of worth. Princess He Jin stood in her observation pod, watching as Captain Tae-ho prepared for the first trial. The council had insisted on this. If a human dared to court their princess, he must prove himself by their most sacred standards. "No off-worlder has ever survived the trials," Elder Sung-ho reminded her, his voice carrying artificial sympathy. "The human's genetic structure simply isn't equipped for our challenges." "Perhaps that's why we need him," He Jin replied softly, "to show us what we've forgotten about true strength." The first trial began without warning. The arena floor transformed, creating a maze of shifting crystal that reflected and refracted light in ways designed to disorient even the most enhanced Australi minds. Tae-ho stood at its center, wearing only the simple garments provided by tradition. "The trial of perception," Jae-yun whispered. "It's designed to test genetic enhancements to visual processing and mental mapping." They watched as Tae-ho studied the maze. Unlike Australi candidates who would have relied on enhanced vision to decode the patterns, he closed his eyes. His hand touched the nearest crystal wall, and he began to move. "What is he doing?" Elder Sung-ho demanded. "He can't possibly navigate by touch alone." But Tae-ho continued forward, his movements slow but steady. Where others would have tried to calculate the perfect path, he felt his way through, learning from each wrong turn, adapting to the maze's rhythm. He's not trying to be perfect, He Jin realized. He's allowing himself to fail and learn. The second trial targeted genetic strength and endurance. Gravity increased steadily, threatening to crush any being not engineered to withstand it. Taiho's muscles strained, sweat dripped from his brow. Displays of effort that made the watching Astrali uncomfortable. His form is all wrong, one council member critiqued. No efficiency in his movements at all. Yet he endured. Where Astrali candidates would have relied on perfectly engineered muscles and bones, Taiho's body adapted, finding new ways to move under the crushing pressure. Each step was a struggle, but each struggle made him stronger. The third trial was meant to test mental perfection, a complex problem-solving challenge that required processing speeds no unmodified brain could match. The crystal walls displayed streams of data, patterns that would overwhelm any natural neural network. Taiho studied the patterns, then did something that caused gasps among the observers. He laughed. "The answer isn't in the patterns," he called out, his voice echoing through the arena. "It's in what's missing from them." "Impossible," Elder Sung-ho sputtered. "The patterns contain all necessary data." "No," He-jin interrupted, seeing what Taiho had noticed. "They contain what we think is necessary. We've become so focused on perfection that we've lost the ability to see beyond it." Taiho's solution wasn't perfect by Astrali standards. It was messy, intuitive, and entirely human. But it worked. The final trial was the most dangerous, a test of genetic purity that would subject the candidate to raw energy fields designed to reveal any flaws in their biological makeup. Many enhanced Astrali have failed this test, their perfect genes proving too rigid to adapt. "He'll die," Jae-yun whispered as the energy field activated. "No unmodified being can survive this." The energy engulfed Taiho, making his unenhanced DNA visible to all. The council members leaned forward, expecting to see it shatter under the strain. Instead, they watched in astonishment as his genetic structure bent, but didn't break, shifted but didn't shatter. "Impossible," Elder Sung-ho breathed. "His genes, they're adapting, changing, but maintaining integrity. Because they're meant to change," He-jin said, understanding finally dawning. "We engineered that ability out of ourselves in our pursuit of perfection. But it's not a flaw. It's the very thing that makes life possible." When the energy field finally died down, Taiho stood unsteady but alive. His body showed signs of change, subtle mutations that had allowed him to survive. He was no longer quite the same as when he'd entered the trials, but he was alive and stronger for the experience. He-jin descended from her observation pod, ignoring the protests of the council members. She walked across the arena floor to where Taiho waited, his imperfect but triumphant smile warming something deep inside her. "You did it differently than anyone before," she said. "Because I am different," he replied simply. "That's not a weakness, princess. It's a strength your people have forgotten." Around them, the crystal wall still displayed his genetic structure, now slightly altered by the trials. But unlike the rigid perfection of Astrali DNA, his showed something remarkable: the ability to change, to adapt, to grow. "The trials are designed to test perfection," Elder Sung-ho announced, his voice carrying the weight of tradition. "This display of adaptation does not meet our standards." "Then perhaps," He-jin replied, taking Taiho's hand in full view of the council, "it's time to change our standards." Above them, through the crystal dome of the arena, the three moons of their world hung in perfect alignment. But even they, He-jin realized, were constantly changing. Their perfect dance was one of eternal adaptation, not rigid stability. The trial of worth had been meant to prove a human's inadequacy. Instead, it had revealed a truth the Astrali had forgotten. That true worth lay not in achieved perfection, but in the ability to grow beyond it. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council had never seen such an assembly. Representatives from 1,000 worlds gathered to witness what many had thought impossible: the union of an Astrali royal with a human. The crystal walls pulsed with soft light, reflecting the tension and excitement that filled the air. Princess Hejin stood before her people, her iridescent skin catching the light of the 3 moons that shone through the vast dome above. Beside her, Captain Taho wore a simple Earth military uniform, its lack of enhancement crystals and genetic markers standing in stark contrast to the elaborate astrali formal wear around them. For 10,000 years, Hejin began, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, we Astrali have pursued perfection. We engineered our genes, programmed our emotions, and calculated every step of our development. And in doing so, we nearly engineered ourselves into extinction. A murmur ran through the crowd. Elder Sung-ho stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled concern. Your Highness, surely you're not suggesting that our pursuit of perfection was wrong. Not wrong, Hejin replied, gesturing to the garden visible through the crystal walls. There, among the perfectly engineered flowers, Taho's earth plant had spawned a whole section of naturally growing variations, just incomplete. We forgot that perfection isn't an end, it's a journey. She turned to face the assembled representatives, noting how the younger Astrali had begun to show signs of change. Some had allowed their hair to grow in natural patterns. Others had begun to move with less rigid precision. Small imperfections, but each one a victory of life over programming. Look at what the human presence has shown us, she continued. When Captain Taho saved us from the gravity generator crisis, he didn't use perfect calculations. When he passed the trials of worth, he didn't follow our engineered patterns. He adapted, he grew. He showed us what we have forgotten. That life itself is a dance between order and chaos. Taho stepped forward, taking her hand in a gesture that would have been unthinkable months ago. Your people haven't grown weaker by accepting change, he addressed the council. You've grown stronger, more resilient, more alive. Images appeared on the crystal walls, recordings from the past months. Young Astrali dancing with human partners, their movements a beautiful blend of precision and passion. Scientists working together, combining Astrali technology with human intuition to create new solutions. And most striking of all, children born to those who had chosen to reduce their genetic enhancements, showing natural variations that carried both strength and beauty. We stand at a crossroads, Hejin declared. We can cling to our perfect cage, or we can learn to fly free. Yes, freedom brings risk. Yes, change brings uncertainty. But look at what we've gained already. The chamber's atmosphere shifted as she spoke. The rigid postures of the Astrali began to relax. Expressions of genuine emotion, hope, fear, excitement, showed on faces that had been engineered to remain passive. Our union, she continued, squeezing Taho's hand, is more than a marriage. It's a symbol of what we can become when we stop trying to eliminate our differences and start learning from them instead. From the crowd, Jayan stepped forward. She no longer wore the traditional attendance robes, but a new design that blended astrally and earth styles. The younger generation supports this union, she announced. We've tasted freedom. We've felt real joy. We cannot, will not, go back to mere existence. Elder Sung-ho raised his hands for silence. And what of our achievements? Our technological superiority, our genetic purity. All preserved, Taho answered, but no longer as chains binding you to one path. Instead, they become tools for exploring new possibilities. Hejin moved to the center of the chamber, where a beam of light from the 3 moons converged. I choose this path, she declared, not because it is perfect, but because it is right. I choose love over calculation, growth over stagnation, life over mere existence. The chamber erupted in something that had never been heard in an astrally formal gathering, spontaneous applause. It started with the humans present, spread to the younger Astrali, and finally reached even some of the council members. As the sound washed over them, Hejin and Taho sealed their union in both Earth and Astrali traditions. Their kiss, a human gesture that had once been considered primitive, drew gasps and smiles from the crowd. Outside, In the palace gardens, their first earth flower had spawned a whole new species. The flowers grew in patterns that defied engineering, each one slightly different, each one beautiful in its own way. Like the society that now grew around them, they were neither purely earth nor purely astrally, but something new and wonderful. The three moons shone down on a civilization in transformation. In homes across the capital, perfect gardens began to include spaces for natural growth. In research centers, scientists began studying the strength found in adaptation rather than just perfection. In schools, young Astrali learned both the precision of their ancestors and the passion of their new allies. And in the heart of the palace, a princess who had once been engineered for perfection found something far more precious, the perfect imperfection of true love, and the dawn of a new age for her people. What happens now? Jia asked as the celebration continued around them. He-Jin looked at Taiho, then at the changing world beyond the crystal walls. Now, she said, we truly begin to live. Above them, the three moons continued their eternal dance, watching as the most advanced civilization in the galaxy learned its greatest lesson, that perfection wasn't an endpoint, but a journey best taken hand in hand with those who could show you new ways to grow. The end.